And if you think about the many worlds theory, which is one of the way physics has tried to deal with the idea that that everything that has happened, everything that could happen has happened, and everything has like multiple branches or infinite branches, and you have the multiverse. And I think people have some idea of what I'm talking about here. What if the many worlds thesis is complete bullshit and doesn't exist?
I'm with you. Yeah,
cannot be there, but the fundamental force that binds those infinite branchings, what if that fundamental force is the force of consciousness?
Welcome back to the Mind Meld, Wonder Dippers, and I am elated to, for a change, drop this one on YouTube first, and also because we have best-selling author, mind explorer, really just polymath in general, Scott Carney, back on the show. Scott has written some true gems. I first became aware of him through his most popular book, What Doesn't Kill Us, in which he explored cold exposure and worked with Wim Hof extensively. But he's written a number of other truly Wonder Whisker tickling books as well. And this is the best mind meld Scott and I have ever done, because we get straight into some of my very favorite curiosities: consciousness, the nature of reality, genuine spirituality versus spiritual fuckery, as well as one of Scott's latest obsessions, which will be the topic of his new book, The Power of Napping and Sleeping to Supercharge Creativity and Your Human Capacities in General. And on that note, my friends, let's not waste any time. For all the information on Scott and his latest endeavor, check the link in the description. For all the information on how to support Third Eye Drops, do the same. Don't forget to boop that like and subscribe for me, and let's get into it. Welcome back to the Mind Meld, Scott. You are always one of my favorite people to meld minds with, because you just have such a wide breadth of knowledge from the myriad of books that you've written that I feel like you just have a really well-developed, nuanced worldview. And that's my favorite kind of person to talk to, because I just feel it's like we were just talking about in the pre-talk. It's getting harder and harder to have those nuanced conversations. It's like there's this grasping for, but are you going to end up on my side? Are you going to end up in the same way I think? And
I don't even know what side I'm on anymore. Man.
Yeah, me neither. Yeah. What's a side? What's a side when it comes to anything ideological or psychical? Like, there's no sides in that dimension. That's an amorphous blob of ever complexifying, ever morphing phenomena.
Whoa, man. Well, I just want to say that I am always psyched to talk to you for the same reason, is because trying on new ideas is like most of the fun of being alive in the first place, and like letting your mind range around to different topics, even if they're absurd. And you cover absurd things. I cover absurd things. We look at the absurd and then trying to find what the rational part, going out there in order to come back, and maybe that journey was absolutely useful. And it's cool that the world is actually having these conversations.
Definitely. And maybe it's not useful, by the way, but sometimes it's still fun anyway. But so we didn't even talk about this just before, but I checked out your video on, I think you titled it just something like "What Happens When We Die" or something like that. And I wasn't expecting you to go where you went in it, but it's another one of those fortuitous things, because the last video I released about a week ago is about the sort of, about as close to scientific canonization as you can get, with the Nobel Prize in Physics being awarded to the three quantum physicists. I think it's Zellinger. I'm forgetting all three of their names now. I'm already forgetting. This is what happens. You cover all these topics and you start to forget details. But
I like that you're trying to list the names, because no one in the audience knows, or if they can also just Google it, it's there. The information is there.
But anyway, it's funny because where you went in the video almost immediately with like no lube, which I really appreciated, is where I was trying to end the video. But so how did you this? I'll let you summarize it for people before I try to.
All right. So it's funny. Funnily enough, I was watching a TV show called Midnight Mass, which you should totally watch.
Oh
It's
yeah,
about
yeah.
it's a great show, and I don't want to give spoilers to it because it's worth it just to watch all the seasons, all 8 episodes. But there's one point in it where two different characters are discussing what
Yes.
what it will be like when you die, and they have different visions. There's a Christian vision, there's sort of like a more DMT psychedelic vision, and there's sort of like a spiritualist general vision. And one of the discussions was like, dude, that's what I've been saying all along. And which is basically, you can talk chemically, like what is the experience of your death? And we all know that there's this sort of light at the end of the tunnel that a lot of people report, which can be described physically, like maybe this is your pineal gland and neurons firing. It's basically your screensaver going off. It could be the release of DMT, and it could be actually entering into the spirit world. And one thing that I think about all the time is I don't necessarily believe in a heaven or hell. I'm sort of agnostic on reincarnation, but I do know that if you look back to the very beginning of the universe, at one point, absolutely everything was connected. The singularity, the ultimate singularity, not the singularity in a black hole, but the singularity of singularities. It was all matter in existence squished into something that was infinitely small. All the energy, absolutely every piece of matter that's in your body was part of this singularity. And then it exploded for some reason, which we can never truly understand what that reason was. And all that matter went absolutely everywhere. So when someone says you're stardust, right? We're all just stardust, man. That's true. But we're actually, even before stardust, you actually literally, every atom in your body was the universe. If you look out into the night sky and you see a little twinkling bit of light, every atom in your body was touching every atom in that other star. And now what's so exciting about that Nobel Prize is that they say they're talking about spooky action at a distance, which is this idea of entanglement, where two particles are responding to each other, regardless of the distance between them. You spin one electron this way, and that other electron spins in relationship to that. And now that we know that it can be entangled, we also know that there was a physical moment, a literal moment, where everything was touching and everything was entangled. And then when that exploded, if you think about us being conscious, like I'm not 100% sure that humans are conscious. What I like to think is that we are the universe being conscious of itself. So we are just one aspect of a giant other conscious.
Yeah, it just came to my mind when you said that is humans aren't conscious. Conscious is human. Consciousness is
100%.
human would be more grammatically acceptable, but yeah.
And I think that whatever, I believe that the subjectivity and that your experience of the world is vitally important to you, but also maybe to the universe itself. There's something about the particularity of consciousness and the way it makes decisions that I think might be a fundamental force. But we're going to go way out there, right? Basically, we're on the fringes of my book, The Wedge, right now.
Yeah.
Which came out a couple of years ago.
Right. Yeah, and it's great. I loved that book. That's one of my favorites of yours for sure. But yeah, this idea of non-locality being canonized, like, and not only through this. Well, just to summarize, people who haven't watched my video, people were not comfortable with this idea for obvious reasons, because it violates all kinds of fundamental laws, like particularly the speed of light. The fastest informational travel that's supposed to be able to happen, obviously, is the speed of light. That's supposed to be what governs the laws of physics, according to Einstein. And Einstein and other physicists launched a formal argument against this idea of spooky action at a distance or non-locality. And they tried to highlight through this logical thought experiment. They tried to show how absurd it was. Like, look, you're saying that you could launch entangled particles in opposite ends of the solar system, and then Alice measures it and finds that the spin of this one is up, and then instantaneously this other one is down. Like, that doesn't make any sense. That's not possible. So, but then all the subsequent experiments that were actually done after decades and decades, which eventually culminated in an experiment where they did launch particles into actual outer space miles and miles apart, every single time the quantum weirdness was repeated and shown to be true, and this apparent violation of the speed of light was shown. So there's just something fundamental in the universe that things pop into reality and they do not respect the established laws of physics. Like they just defy
Mm-hmm.
all logic. And to your point, we all came out of that. And
Mm-hmm.
I reached the same conclusion as you, because you get to this point where you run into what's called the measurement problem in
Mm-hmm.
quantum physics, where what is it when this measurement occurs that collapses the wave function, that turns a potential into a material object. This is
Mm-hmm.
at the foundation of quantum physics turning into tactile real
Sure.
world physics for people that don't know. Like, what is actually causing that to happen? And
Yes.
most people immediately think like, whoa, so you're telling me consciousness is involved? And then a lot of scientists don't like this interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless, I think it makes total sense, particularly in the way that you're talking about it, because it's not human consciousness. It's like fundamental consciousness. And
Yes.
that also serves a function of crossing or bridging the explanatory gap that
Mm-hmm.
exists in the brain, like the brain to consciousness that we don't
Mm-hmm.
yet understand.
Yeah.
And I'm
And
pulling
we
from
can't
multiple,
even
yeah.
we can't even study it, right? We can't even study the phenomenology. Like we can look at phenomenology, which is the study of experience, and we can look at neurology and physical matter stuff. But we'll probably never be able to bridge that gap in any sort of way that is like definitely answered. And and in some ways that's totally fine. Like there's no reason why humans have to have the tools to understand the fundamental nature of the universe. That is a huge leap of faith that
Yeah.
we could ever get to that point. But I like to think, again, this is an unprovable statement, right? But I like to think that consciousness is a fundamental force in the universe, something like gravity, something like the weak nuclear force, something, and if you think about the many worlds theory, which is one of the way physics has tried to deal with the idea that
Yep.
that everything that has happened, everything that could happen has happened, and everything has like multiple branches or infinite branches, and you have the multiverse. And I think people have some idea of what I'm talking about here. What if the many world thesis is complete bullshit and doesn't exist?
Yeah,
Like
I'm with you. Yeah.
cannot be there, but the fundamental force that binds those infinite branchings, what if that fundamental force is the force of consciousness, right? If you have this indefinite future, and like if time is like a zipper, right? You zip up time, and there's a million paths on top of that zipper, but the zipper is like what has happened. What if consciousness is the factor that takes the indefinite reality and chooses one of those many paths? And that force of going from like a particle snaps into another particle, and it could go left or right, it chose the right path. That choosing, that moment of deciding this way or that way from the essence of randomness is consciousness. And then when you build it up to like human forms, or what a crayfish's consciousness is, or anything else, like what if this is the fundamental thing, the thing that makes the indefinite into definite? I think that there's something there that is very, very important. But whenever I write like famous physicists about this, they just never respond to me. Like I sent Brian Greene a note, like I was sending all these physicists, and they're like, dude, another weirdo spiritualist talking to me. So
Yeah. And what's funny is they do prefer the many. So there's three common answers. Really, now there's two common answers, I believe, to this measurement problem. One is the many worlds interpretation. The other is the Copenhagen interpretation. And then there's sort of an offshoot of the Copenhagen interpretation, which is the Wigner interpretation. And that's what we're talking about. Because Wigner looked at, things like Schrodinger's cat and other, kind of thought experiments and implications of quantum physics, and looked at this kind of, he laid out this scenario where basically there's, quantum physics seems to imply that there's this infinite regression of witnessing that holds all of reality together. So not only in the Schrodinger's cat thought experiment, which, to refresh people's memory, is you put a cat into a sealed box, and you also put in some sort of lethal radioactive substance, which is also
that triggers the movement of a
yeah,
radioactive substance, triggers, which is true random, triggers a cyanide capsule to
yes,
kill the cat. Right.
right, right.
So the
Yeah,
randomness
so
of radioactive decay is what kills the cat.
yes, yes. So
Mhm.
you don't know if the cat is alive or dead. And not only do you not know, according to the principles of quantum physics, the cat is in a superposition of being both alive and dead until it's either witnessed or measured. And then Wigner, this other physicist, comes along and is like, well, forget the cat. What about me? Like, what about like what's holding my existence in balance? What's collapsing the wave function of my existence? And then this has became known as Wigner's friend, because it's like, well, my friend who looks at me is kind of holding me in existence, and his friend, and you see what I mean about this infinite
Mm-hmm.
regression. It just keeps going
Mm-hmm.
back and back until you get to that initial probably wave collapse moment that you're talking about of the Big Bang,
Mm-hmm.
of just like everything witnessing everything into
Mm-hmm.
existence, kind of.
Yeah, this is what his name has just passed me. The original guy in Cosmos, Carl Sagan. This is
Yeah.
what he said. You know, what is the recipe for an apple pie? Well, first you have to create the universe, right? Because if you go
Yeah.
all the way back, because like, you know, where'd the apple come from? Where'd the seed come from? Well, the blah 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 blah. Boom, we have to get back to the Big Bang to understand really how everything happens.
Yeah.
But there's a segue here, and I need to put this to you, as we're talking about these really, really abstract, weird concepts in the world. And Michael, you know that I have this book that I'm working on, which is all about abstract concepts, called A Time to Nap, which is about how we come up with creative ideas that make the you, and the me. And so what I'm doing is I'm running this like, you know, little fundraising campaign, like a super tiny one, because I have become fascinated how sleep and dreaming
Mm-hmm.
create connections in our brain that give us fundamentally novel ideas. And, you know, when you're talking about, you know, this friend who witnesses you, you're actually also doing that in your brain. Your brain is witnessing itself while
Oh,
it's
wow.
dreaming in NREM sleep, and deciding what memories, what experiences in your recent life, right? Those stored, I think it's in the hippocampus, right? We have all of the last day's memories. And it's like, well, I'm going to ditch most of this stuff. I'm going to take instead those that talk I had with Michael, this thing I had with my wife, and the petting the cat. Those are going to be the three things that I remember from today. And I'm going to store those into, get this, feelings. Like, it just takes the gist of the world that you were living in and
Interesting.
stores it as a feeling, and then that is what your memory is. And that's actually, you know, that is how we navigate the world, mostly by our feelings, right? We're not all looking at hard data and being like, yesterday I did this and this, and then I had this rational understanding of that, and then I put together this to decide my actions. No, you're like, hey, I'm going outside and it feels like a nice day, and let's go have a
Totally.
nice time. And that all happens in sleep. That all happens in dreaming. And I'm just tickled pink to be able to like spend time writing a book about napping. So for my plug, which all of you listeners are thinking, wow, this guy sounds like a total psycho. I have a Kickstarter link somewhere. Maybe you'll post it in the notes or somewhere. It's called
Yeah,
A
yeah,
Time to
sure.
Nap. It's on Kickstarter, and it's great to be learning about dreaming, and then how you can take like short sleeps, like what Dali did. You know,
Yeah, yeah.
Salvador Dali,
Of course,
right?
yeah.
What he used to do, his stuff's like bananas, right? You look at these melting clocks and ships with butterfly wings and all of that stuff. What he used to do to come up with these ideas was not drop acid. It was actually to take a nap while holding like a spoon or a steel ball in his hand. And as he's falling asleep, he enters into the very first NREM sleep stages. NREM is non-rapid eye movement sleep, and stuff happens there where you just begin dreaming, but you're sort of awake. And then when his hand relaxes, the ball hits the ground. He's like, oh, it wakes him up. And then you have this like 30-minute period where your dream state
Yeah.
and your conscious state are sort of overlapping, and you have these new and fundamentally novel ideas. And that's when he would like write down what he was thinking or paint some idea that would then ultimately become a painting, become his like imaginary world. And it's fascinating. And I think that one of the things that I found out in the last week, talking with sleep scientists and at MIT, was that uh, consciousness, awareness. Like right now, when you and I are talking, I'm looking at you, and aware consciousness assumes direct linear relationships. So if I show you a picture of a cup, your next thought might be cupboard, right? Cup to cupboard, or tea, cup to tea, where you see like a normal like relationship, and you get very focused when you're highly aware. However, in dream states, the associations become actually distal, more distant. So you see a cup, you might think walrus, or you might think spaceship, or you might think, mother or something like that. And actually, you are not predisposed to make close relationships. You're unlikely to go to cupboard from cup. And then and this is because in dream states you're trying to make abstract connections that make sense of the world, store them in feelings, and then like choose to navigate. And not always the straight line is the best line to do that. We evolved for this, and there's so much more to say on that like odd concept.
Yeah, well, on the sort of tip of the creative and consciousness based elements of sleeping, that transitory state, that liminal state between waking and sleeping, is one of the most interesting, fertile states for like philosophical speculation, I think, because I've had some very weird experiences, like more times than I can count, where I'm like drifting off to sleep, and I feel like I'm hearing voices. Like I feel like I'm hearing like chatter, and I don't know if this is like just electrical signals in the brain turning into like junk information, or if I'm receiving this from, it's almost like a radio station, like you're just hearing random bits of like broadcasts or something like that. And then of course too, like if anybody's been about to fall asleep and jerked awake, and you see in the sort of fringes of your eyes these like fractally patterns that sort of just like quickly dissipate, like you're like, what was that? And then it's gone, that like who knows what's going on with all of this. I'm sure some of it is just reductive to neurochemistry, but some of it is like do you know what Edgar Casey is?
I do not know.
He's one of these people who is either the most prolific psychic ever to live or the most prolific con man. And his technique for getting into the visionary state where you could pose a question to him was he had to get into that state like between waking and sleep. And he's got like a huge archive of predictions, and he supposedly correctly predicted all kinds of different things. But whatever's going on in that state, it's very interesting.
Well, that's what dreams are all about, is actually predicting the future, right? Like, and that's what feelings are about. It's predicting. The brain is a prediction machine, right? When you walk through the world, you open a door, you expect your living room to be on the other side of the door because you've been through that a million times. But babies don't have that, right? A baby that you can play peekaboo, it's like, oh, what's behind the hand? Oh, it's the face. Oh, what's behind the hand? Oh, it's the face. And the brain actually learns to develop connections, both sort of like static. I know the living room is there, but also what would happen if I went down the street and there was a clown or a school shooter or the president or whatever it is, or whatever
a clown
you want.
School shooter, that would be even worse.
Probably don't give anyone any ideas, right? We're in America. but you have these there's random things happen in the world that are unexpected all the time, and dreams are where that you can make those abstract connections happen that then let you prepare for the unexpected, right? And when you're asleep, you also are paralyzed, right? So your body doesn't move. You're having a dream and it's reenacting something in the real world. Like the other day, I remember waking up, I remember dreaming about serving tacos in a gondola to some friends, right? And I woke up and I said,
and that's when I messaged you and I was like, I guess what I had for dinner last night, tacos.
Tacos, yeah. And I woke up and said, enjoy the tacos. But like if your body was connected, your motor functions were connected to your dreams, I might actually go and make tacos, which is not a good motions to move. I might end up punching my wife next to me. So your body has this evolutionary program to create this fantasy world to safely make these connections for your brain to live out the future. And then in the waking world, you have this sort of very straight arrow line that actually draws on those hypnagogic, that's the word for what you were talking about when you were hearing these voices, hypnagogic hallucinations that you're having, and they're totally connected. And so your friend who's like, not your friend, Casey, who has these predictions. Well, the brain is a prediction machine. So if he writes down 1,000 predictions that seem weird and abstract, like think about the Simpsons, right? They've predicted the future like 100 times, right? It's not because they knew what the future was. It's because they made so many abstract thoughts that sometimes abstract things become real. And I think a better study of his psychic nature, which I don't know anything about him, maybe he knows everything, but do a statistical analysis of his correct predictions versus his incorrect predictions, and it might be slightly better than other people's. It might be 100% accurate, or it could be he just made 1 billion predictions, and if I make 1 billion predictions, I'm gonna nail some of them.
Yeah. Well, I think if psychic phenomenon exists, it's definitely not a perfect tool, but I do think that you should take statistically significant data just as seriously as you would any other science, even if you don't like the mechanism at play. You know, if it's statistically significantly higher likelihood to be psychic than not, why would you not take that data seriously? I mean, I don't know. I mean, because it does seem like that's an ongoing, the whole like psi research community is constantly doing experiments where they're like, hey, we got this data. And then there's a whole sect of the population that just they won't accept the data no matter how statistically significant it is. But,
it's interesting.
Go ahead.
Maybe what's going on, let's say he's right. I don't know anything about him, but let's say that he is like getting things right. It could be that the scientific community doesn't accept this because it's a noumenal explanation. He has access to another world of information, and that he's drawing this out of the ether, and that's where his psychic powers come from. And the scientific community is like, oh, there's no ether. But what if we change the logic behind it and just say when he's thinking abstractly, that he's seeing connections of the world that other people aren't seeing, and they become real because he just knows, because the data he's already accumulated, he's able to combine in novel ways, which is exactly what we talk about with machine learning. Right? It's exactly what we talk about with machine learning, where the computer sucks up all the data from the internet and now knows that you're going to buy diapers next week. And it knows. This is also the plot of Westworld, which was a show that's terrible actually now. But the idea with Westworld,
I agree. Yeah, I think it jumped the shark. Yeah.
But the idea there is that the computer, they fed all the data of human life into a computer, and now we don't have free will anymore because now it knows what's going to happen. And maybe he's just the computer at that point.
Yeah. Well, I think the output of consciousness, like the input of conscious experience plus consciousness, is like we don't know what the aggregate output of that is because we don't understand one of the variables, which we've already touched on, consciousness. We don't know what its capacities are. We don't know if it's a thing that, like, maybe in the same way that we discovered quantum weirdness, maybe we'll discover some variable that points to the fact that consciousness must exist, even if we can't, like we haven't ever captured the quantum weirdness. We just use it. We haven't ever captured gravity. We just use it. Like, we know it exists because of behaviors, but we don't fucking know what it is. Like, they want, like, in the same history of this quantum weirdness, they wanted to know what that mechanism was. They wanted to find a hidden variable that connected those entangled particles that would make it all make sense. Never happened. They're just like, we don't know. That's just how it is. And we give up trying to like explain it any more than that. Now we'll just use it as a tool. But maybe that will happen with consciousness, and it will give us some breakthrough ability. Like, there are some people who think this, like some very brilliant people like Dr. Donald Hoffman thinks will eventually make this discovery. But until then, we just don't know. Like, we don't know if like all of these ideas about psychic phenomenon and what consciousness is capable of, or it could be a totally absurd conversation to even be having. Like, we just don't know, but it's endlessly fascinating.
I think we'll never be able to know it. And I think that there's I think the word is philological reason for this, which is that the very philosophy of science, right, of reductivism, right, which is the idea that you take something down to its parts, and then you can build, and then once you understand all the parts, you can build up to the reality that we live in. Well, that can answer certain sorts of questions really well, right? That's a very powerful tool for understanding mechanical interactions.
Right.
But what if consciousness is fundamentally not a mechanical interaction, right? If
Right.
it's fundamentally something else that doesn't have parts but is a whole, reductionism philosophically could never validate consciousness. And this is the problem, is that I don't think that science, the way we talk about science, which is reductivist science, will ever have the tools to understand what the mind is. And the fascinating part of this is we all know the mind exists. Right? We all know we are talking right now, we are thinking right now, we are having language, and something is happening. And science cannot prove that it's happening. And I think it's the problem is with the tool and with the insight and with our hopes for the tool. And what we fundamentally need is a different paradigm to think about validity. How versus saying if we just smash we get a higher energy atom smasher together, eventually we'll find the thing, the Higgs boson of consciousness. And I actually just don't think that will ever happen. I think that if you smash particles, you might just get ever and ever smaller particles until you get, what if there's a trillion more levels of Higgs boson size things, right? Because there's an infinite amount of space in fractions as there is in whole numbers. It could go that far. I mean, I don't know. No one knows.
Yeah. It is super interesting. One of the most, I'm just remembering this from a book that I read several years ago at this point. I think it's called something like Why the World Exists or something along those lines. And the whole book revolves around the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And he, just goes and interviews all these philosophers and physicists and whatever. And I had kind of the hairs in the back of my neck stand up when he was talking about the idea of actually trying to create an environment where you get as close to possible as nothingness. And have you ever heard that phrase? I think it's like nature abhors a vacuum or something to that extent. But they've actually shown now that if you try to create an absolute vacuum, like of like no particles, no activity whatsoever, the Higgs field still essentially instantaneously starts arranging reality and like assigning particles behaviors and spins and shit like that. It's so crazy. Like that really does seem like like there's some just programmer on call or something at all times that's just like, oh, come on, guys, you got to make me program reality all over again. Jesus Christ. Like that's almost what it feels like.
Yeah, well, what is space is the question, right? Before the Big Bang, there was a dot, right? Oh, here's a bananas thought, right? Right there was this dot, there was the singularity, and it exploded, right? It exploded, and then it created the universe, which we think is like huge, right? But what if it didn't explode? What if the idea of that dot, that's all space in the whole universe, right? What if it still like the concept of exploding when you don't have space is meaningless, right? Because there's nothing for it to expand into. The only thing that happened is this thing became more articulated, right? You actually found out what was in this thing by looking deeper into it. And the space time, this idea that these two things are fundamentally related, like maybe there was no Big Bang, maybe it just was like looking inside.
Maybe it was an introspective Big Bang. Who knows? That's really interesting, man. Thinking of trying to conceive of nothing or how one thing turns into everything, it's like a Zen koan. It doesn't make sense, yet it seems like all of the evidence points toward it. And that's kind of one of those things where I'm like, ooh, yeah, that sounds like an important paradox. Like it doesn't make sense intellectually, but it's one of those things that, because it's so counterintuitive, it's like, yeah, there's something there. There's something like very, very important and central. Like because you eventually, if you take anything, like you bump up against a mystery at some point, the deeper you go into it. And I feel like that's just a prime example of it's like, it's literally like trying to, the only thing harder, I think, than conceiving of nothing is trying to conceive of like what God would be. It's like equally difficult. Like, if like a sophisticated idea about God in the sort of like Joseph Campbellian sense. Like one of my favorite, oh, I'm trying to think of the quote now, but he has this incredible quote where it's a series where he's talking about like yogic philosophy and stuff, and he talks about how the last symbol on the journey of enlightenment is this goddess holding the severed head of the creator, and the whole point of it is to highlight the idea that if you ever want to actually have a mystical experience where you're united with the non-dual majesty that underlies everything, the very last thing you have to do is kill your idea of God to actually experience, whatever that mystery is. And I've always just loved that.
Well, if you meet the Buddha on the path to enlightenment, you must kill him, right? That's a Buddhist saying. Yeah, I mean, all of this mystical experiences and religious thought ultimately comes down to that contradiction, right? It's like, how do we know what we know? What is faith? What is not faith? And what is the difference between 0 and 1? And the beauty of faith, I believe, is that it is a journey versus a destination. And it's like, if we knew, let's say we knew that God was there, he was a dude in a cloud, and he dictates everything that happens on earth and decides who goes to heaven, who doesn't. And like, we know we could put a telescope up there and he's pointing at things. We're like, no, that's like legit what is happening. It wouldn't make life very fun to live, would it? Right? It would just make it sort of, it would take out all the mystery, which is all the fun, which is all the interest, which is all the challenge and tension in life that actually is why we strive to do things. And if we ever met the Buddha on the path to enlightenment, we would be a problem. And actually, this is the not plot, but this is the central point in my book, The Enlightenment Trap, which I'm re-releasing in January, is that the people who hear God or attain enlightenment or whatever that final state is, they are, and I'm gonna put I'm gonna draw my line in the sand here. They are universally insane. Right? They have universally lost touch with reality if they believe that they understand the ultimate reality. And I know this for two reasons. One, because they start talking nonsense. And B, they all start fucking their young students, their young pretty students, which makes me start thinking that they're really thinking with their scrotum ultimately than they are with their actual spiritual perfection. Because we are all like, we're all wrestling against a question that cannot be answered. And if it could be answered, then we've made an error.
Yeah. One of my favorite, I'm glad we're on this topic now. I told you this before we started recording, that the video that I'm currently working on that I just finished, I started recording some stuff, some really goofy stuff for this morning. The video I'm working on is about toxic spiritual influencers who essentially coerce people into, like, the low stakes version of it is consuming their content, and then it kind of goes up from there, right? Like you get someone, you appeal to someone's anxiety, to someone's grasping for wealth, to someone's general malaise with a sort of unspoken, sometimes it is just straight up spoken, but a suggestion that you've got answers that they don't have. And it at a minimum keeps you watching. It might get you buying, and it might get you behaving or doing things in the long run that you never would have normally done. It might destroy your mental health. It might destroy your finances on the extreme end of things. But all of that, like, I want to go further into that in a second, but I also want to go back and address this whether or not you can be enlightened thing. I think that's another one of those primary paradoxes that is interesting, that is like, stop right there at the point that it's interesting and don't try to solve it. And there's actually something called the two truths doctrine in Buddhism that simultaneously holds up the, what's real? Is it this reality of tactile things, or is there some absolute reality that's like a oneness, that's a whatever? And according to this two truths doctrine, I forgot the the actual Buddhist term, but it's like, no, it's both. Like there is an absolute reality of non-dual awareness, and you can touch that reality. But as long as you're alive, you are not that reality. You're living corporally in relative reality, and you can't, as long as you're alive, live in that non-dual reality. The most you can do is like visit, and then you come right back. And I think that that's a satisfying, like, liminal counterpoint to the dualism for me.
Sure, and it's one thought in Buddhism, right? There's
Right.
many thoughts in Buddhism. Like you have to look at Buddhism as like a cultural process, just like Christianity. It's been through thousands of years of iterations, and in the book The Enlightenment Trap, it's about Tibetan Buddhism, which is sort of a very specific offset of Buddhism. And in the 1300s, there was a guy named Dolpopa, who was like the guy. He was like the everyone was talking about Dolpopa back in the day. And what he believed was that the mind created reality, right? And that his like it's sort of like Neo in the Matrix, right? It was called mind-only Buddhism. The mind generates everything, and the ultimate reality is you can only access through meditation. This is my very short summary of Dolpopa. Dolpopa dies in like 30s, 50s, something like that. And this other guy comes up named Tsongkhapa, who had more of what you're saying, right? It's this dualist approach, and not only that, like you should not directly access that ultimate reality, but it's also you have to filter it down, and you have to realize that institutions are also important. So he becomes a great institution builder, and it was a very lively debate at that time between these two schools. And right now, most Tibetans say, well, of course, Tsongkhapa was right. He because the Buddhism that exists now is all through Tsongkhapa, but it's only because he murdered everyone in the Dolpopa school. Right? It's only because they brought the Mongols down, and it wasn't Tsongkhapa himself, but it was like the people around him, and they just murdered all of those other people in the other monasteries. So there's a tale about how he won in the debate grounds, but they weren't actually even alive at the same time, and it was just murder. So we have to also remember that there's these cultural things that go behind every thought that we have. And when we talk about Buddhism, when we talk about any religion, that the historicity is as important as the philosophy.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's like not only is history written by the victors, so is spirituality. Like you don't know what the spirituality of the people who are wiped off the face of the earth is unless you get really lucky and you find some old documents or something. And that's why I'm always I would love you to share some of what you think the commonalities between the sort of deceptive, predatory spirituality is, like the techniques you see them use. But that's definitely one of them is quashing debate and quashing the ability to question. And that's why I love Greek philosophers, like the whole Socratic line, and like Plato in particular, is because everything was about the dialogue. Everything was about trying to get to the truth through interlocuting with people that don't agree with you. And then hopefully through the Socratic method, you come away with a higher understanding, even if you haven't settled, like, like we were talking about before, how do you get to that yes or the no, like at the end of the day? And if this is before we were recording, we should say, but we're talking about how do we get from this question of this place of open-ended questioning to actually getting to a yes or a no. And I was kind of hinting at this before, but to me, I don't really care as much about getting to the yes or the no as much as I do like enriching the process continuously and feeling like I'm on that path. I'm on the path toward getting closer. And I feel like,
that's the best we can do or will ever be able to do. And that is in itself an enlightened thought. You're not enlightened, but the thought is enlightened.
Damn it. I thought you were going to tell me.
Sorry, you're not. I'm not enlightened either. So we're good on that. But I will say, you're asking this question of like, how do we get such like conspirituality? That's one of the ways that we one of the words to talk about the manipulative spirituality that exists right now. And I was thinking the other day on a related topic, which is how do you form a cult? Right? What are the factors that need to create a cult? And it's actually, I studied anthropology for a long time. I got to the PhD and dropped out of the dissertation. And there's a lot of literature written on cults. And what I think you need, there's basically three factors that will give you, cult status. The first is a reified logic, right? So an idea that answers every possible question. And one example of this, there is an ultimate reality and you can't access it, right? And I know what it is, but you don't know. That's a reified idea. Is that so? No one can actually ever give you a question that you can reject because it's not possible to reject it. The second thing you need is a practice, right? Which is a physical thing you do, which preferably alters your senses, but everything alters your senses. So it really could be anything. It could be napping. It could be meditating. It could be taking drugs. It could be, blah, blah, blah. It could be doing exercises. It's a physical practice that you put in your body that you say answers that reified question. So, you can see the ultimate reality if you meditate. You can get to the ultimate reality if you become an entrepreneur. Like, it doesn't matter. It's a physical practice that happens that answers that reified question. And the third thing you need to do is a feeling of inclusivity, where you say to people, I love you. Like, you're not judged. You are allowed in, and you're a good person. And this was the question about like that need that people have. Like, and ultimately the need that we all need is love. And you want to feel like you can be part of this if you do that practice and you understand this philosophy. And once you have those three things locked down, you have everything you need to form a cult and become that cult leader, and then screw all of your young, pretty students. Like, that's all you need to get to that horrible thing that we call a cult.
And meanwhile, I don't think there's anything morally reprehensible or wrong with any of those three things.
Mm-hmm.
It only crosses a line when you abuse it. Because
Yes.
I think we would have to agree, right? If you want to have a spiritual practice, you need to have a behavior you do. You need to have some sort of metaphysical idea that you're aspiring to, or that you think you can access, or something you can understand about yourself or your soul or your psyche or whatever it is. But then there's always this line that an individual chooses to cross, and that's where it gets difficult. And that's what I'm always trying to spot, is like where, like the particulars of what people are preaching or sharing a lot of the time, like the people that I'm looking at in this video, which, by the way, I'm too much of a pussy to name names. I'm not naming any names, but I'm naming
I can name some for you if you want.
behaviors. I'm naming behaviors and like things to watch out for. And then at the end of the day, just like I said before, trying to like encourage critical thinking, because I truly don't know, like a lot of these like individuals. There's so many things I don't know. And
you need to read this book. I'm going to put this on the screen. The Guru Papers, Masks of Authoritarian Power. This is a great book on this question of cult psychology, which I think would be super. It's Diana Alstead and Joel Kramer who wrote it.
So maybe the better question would be, how do you then find better sources of quote unquote spiritual knowledge or wisdom or philosophy?
Well, I think the problem is in reification, actually. It was that first thing that I put down, where one explanation answers everything. It's like everything comes down to let's use the Jedi's midichlorians in your bloodstream, right? Or everything comes down to Scientology. Again, they're sort of like midichlorians. It's like these consciousnesses in your body that were blown up in a volcano.
Yeah,
blah,
what's
blah.
the Scientology one? What is it?
Zool or some
I know what you're talking about. I'll think of it later.
Or Jesus, right? There's this Holy Trinity, and there's God who lays down rules. Like, reification is the problem, because it cuts off the dialectic, which is what you actually love, right? You like it says that you don't know the answer. The answer is this other thing that you cannot test and you can never understand. And I was studying, again, let's go to Tibetan Buddhism, because a lot of people don't know much about it. But they have this idea that they're all spiritual levitating monks in the Himalayas who melt snow all around them. But maybe you've seen a video of Tibetan monks debating. I don't know if you have, but they do this thing where they They're two monks stand opposite each other, and they say in Tibetan, the Buddha said that we are all compassionate beings, right? And then they slap their hands as if there's an argument in one hand, and it slaps into their hand, and they serve it to the other thing, and it's actually fully interesting and dramatic to watch. And they teach each other a logical system to explain Buddhism as a totally rational idea, and that we can say logically that Buddhism exists because phenomenology exists like this, and it's actually a really awesome system. But if you hang out with them for long enough, you realize that everything goes back. Their entire logical system is based on the idea that the Buddha was enlightened and his words are valid no matter what. So you always win the debate by pushing someone to say the Buddha could not be right because he lied, right? And that's how you win all Tibetan Buddhist debates. And it's that fundamental article of faith, which is the problem, is that you can have faith, but you need to be humble about your faith. You need to follow the guru who's like, I believe that this is the way the world works, but I could be wrong. And that is the guru who you should be like, I think I like you. Because if we actually grab every religious leader who is totally sure that their way is right, and you put them into a room, I will promise you they will not agree with each other, right? They will have a fundamental different vision, which leads me to think that there is no one ultimate reality that these people have accessed. Instead, they just say that other guy's wrong and I'm right. This is the problem. You need to be able to have a dialectic between well-intentioned, good people where their actions are integrated in the world to make the things around them a better place as best they can.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you even see that within Tibetan Buddhism, because you see people like the Dalai Lama who seems to have the disposition more of like being able to accept, at least on the surface. Like I know he was quoted as saying like, well, if science disproves part of what we think about the world, we need to change our doctrine because science, but do I really know what he believes in his heart of hearts? No, of course I don't. But yeah, I mean, from the outside looking in, I love Tibetan Buddhism because I love this whole notion of there being this kind of like class of mystics who are just have dedicated their lives to exploring the psyche and trying to understand like the mysteries of consciousness and what happens when you die, and how the Bardo states work, and communing with these different archetypal consciousnesses or gods, if you want to call them that. But yeah, I mean, to your point, like within all of that, there always has to be this tremendous level of faith and trust, because there will always be an opportunity within that to take advantage of people, to lie to people. Like I've seen it firsthand where I've watched people that I generally like and trust, and I see them starting to play with that ability, starting to play with, well, trust me, I know things you don't know, kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, but then just like leave that there as a sort of a little jewel of superiority, like a little jewel of and that's why you need to stick with me, because I'll let you have a little nibble on my transcendence or whatever.
Right. And this is why it works so well on Instagram right now, is because you can present anything you want on Instagram. I get laid more than other people. Look at my six pack. I have all of these friends. I'm rich, and whatever it is you want to present, right? You can present that thing. And the natural human reaction is to be like, yo, I sort of like that. I want some of that. And then they say, well, I obviously figured it out. You want to be part of this? Join my cult. Yeah. And it's like social media is a cult creator. And it's based on a lie. It's based on a conscious lie that we all know exists, but that doesn't stop us from getting sucked into it.
Totally. Yeah. One of the main pieces, like things that I argue in that video, is that one of the core things that allows them to do that, like the short form content, both on YouTube and other forms of social media, really cater to this, is just presenting cherry picked, decontextualized ideas to give yourself this air of spiritual superiority. But meanwhile, if you have any level of knowledge, you're gonna know like that's totally out of fucking context. Like that's not Like, you don't open your third eye in 60 seconds by,
Mm-hmm.
tapping on your forehead and like imagining something. Like, you want to know how to actually supposedly open your third eye? Start with the basics of the eight-limbed path of yoga, which is like a pretty complex like overhaul of your lifestyle if you want to actually travel this path. But if people don't know that when they're watching, it's like, oh really, that's all I need to do? Great. Like,
Well, this
it's
is
not
still assuming
working.
that
I'll watch the next video. I'll take the class.
this is still assuming that the Eightfold Path of Yoga is accurate as well, right? That was a medieval text, right? Patanjali, and um, and there's some things offered in yoga that I'm pretty skeptical about, right? Some of the siddhis that are talked about in the Yoga Sutras, I'm like, can we have telepathy and teleport and levitate and all those things? Well, by now we've had 2,000 years of, or more than that, 5,000 years of people trying these things, and an entire movement in Iowa called Transcendental Meditation, where people are trying to levitate off their mats, and we have not been able to scientifically prove it. I think that it's the attitude of people to dogmatically assume that one thing is right, that the Eightfold Path is right. And I have nothing against the Eightfold Path. Like, it's great, you should do it, but it's still not the answer. But what I think you're saying is that the hyper focus on social media has just compacted the time frame of this, where there's like no questioning. And
Yeah.
have you seen, this is a huge segue, and you're probably not going to be like, wait, what are you talking about, Scott? Have you seen Lady Hulk, attorney at law? What's this called?
No, I haven't.
You know what I'm
I know what
talking
you're
about?
talking about. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. And I just wanted to tell you, just as you were saying that, a yogi actually did teleport into your room and flip you off behind you.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. I saw him,
so
but
confirmed.
it was actually After Effects on my. I have a yoga meme thing that I can activate here. The what is it? Miss She-Hulk, attorney at law. Yeah. So the I was watching this, and it's terrible. I hate Marvel shows, but I thought it would be sort of funny. But the thing that really got me was where the Hulk, who meets She-Hulk, explains Hulkness and how it occurs, right? And he's like, well, the gamma gets uptaked by your third eye, and like he like has this like total bro science explanation where it just sounds, he just says like nonsense science words, and then you're like, oh well, that's the explanation. Okay, well, let's go hulking. But the way he delivered it was just like what you would see on a big podcast. And then he does like sit in full lotus and meditates, because you're like, oh well, he full lotuses and meditates.
Sounds awesome now.
It's like, bro, look at me, and like your gamma's got to get uptaken by your personality matrix, and then we have this blah 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 science instrumentation, and it's designed to let you just suspend your disbelief. Okay, that's how Hulk works. But it's also, interestingly enough, the same way that influencing and cult psychology works. It's the same path. It's just you say it with seriousness and conviction, and people are like, okay, I'll suspend disbelief and try to become a levitating Hulk person. Sure.
Yeah. That sort of like intellectual sophistry or scientific or philosophical sophistry, where the person who's making the argument knows what they're doing. They know that they're either completely manicuring something through language the audience doesn't understand to give off an air of, again, like you can and this shows too that like science and other fields are vulnerable, and I see this happening all the time, where you belittle an argument by showing your superiority through not attacking the merit of the counter argument, but through just trying to do some kind of like show off your plumage, show off your intellectual plumage or whatever, to show that the other person's argument doesn't hold any water. Like that, that's something I see a lot of. And also just to your point too, of trying to just give off an air of like, you got to listen to me because I know these words, bitch. Like that, there's so much of that goes on.
Yeah, why do you think the Catholic Church until the 50s did Mass in Latin?
Oh yeah.
Why do you think Tibetan Buddhism, when it's taught, is taught like partially in Tibetan? It's because you have to put the practice and the effort in to learn that language. And there's your sunk cost right there. why me, the guy born in Providence, Rhode Island, is going to spend time learning Tibetan? It's only if I believe this thing is real. Okay, I've done this, and now I'm like, oh, my questions about why I don't quite agree with your stance on enlightenment, but now I'm in, because I've spent all that effort to do that. And the idea of the esoteric, and then when you pull someone along into that esoteric knowledge, it's hard for them to get away from and reject the time that has been spent to achieve that promise you had on the front end.
So we've had kind of an interesting road in this conversation, because toward the beginning we were getting into flirting with very mystical musings about like reality and consciousness being fundamentally intertwined, which sounds very Vedantic. It sounds very, like every mystical tradition from like east to west essentially boils down to this point of central oneness, of like a central consciousness that's sort of at the root of reality. But then we've also spent a lot of time focusing in on the problematic nature of following any system that purports to get you to that point.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that you personally kind of have arrived at that conclusion through your own primary experiences and dabbling in different things. Like, obviously you do a lot of cold exposure. For people that don't know you, I don't know if you meditate. I know you've had some psychedelic experiences, but how did you reach that point of taking that idea seriously? Was there any philosophical a priori thing, or was it really just your own experience?
When you say that idea, could you just clarify exactly what that idea
like
is?
Actually thinking like, yeah, I mean, consciousness is fundamental to reality, like very similar to what these mystical traditions say,
right,
despite their potential problematic.
Well, I'm an enormous fan of Buddhism, and I've studied, and Hinduism, and I studied it for years. I married an Indian woman. I was married to her for 10 years. Like I have a long history with, and I lived in India for 6 years. I'm just sort of drawn to that philosophy. It's not God heavy, although there is faith involved in it. And just sort of thinking outside the box has happened my whole life, but I'm inveterately skeptical of everything I do. Right? I have to test it myself and see if it works for me. And I think that different things work for different people because we all have different backgrounds. We've all had different dreams, right? And those dreams, which form feelings, which you find in napping, those things are. The things that I do, I see direct benefits from, but I don't know what it all means, I guess, like I have faith that consciousness is not in my body. I think that consciousness is I have one aspect of consciousness in my body, but I also think that consciousness exists outside of my body. And I know this because when I talk to you, you're changing my consciousness. Right. And I think that when we have a dialectic, we are actually creating more consciousness, and consciousness exists in that synapse between us more so than it exists in me. And I look at the brain, and I also realize the brain is made up of synapses, right? And it's that conscious activity which is more important than one static thing. It's like sort of a constant becoming process. And I think that when I look at the scientific research on this, it seems to back me up. Like we have the split brain research. I don't know if you've come across this. Yeah. Nobel Prize winning in the 50s, where they had people who had cut corpus callosums, which is the big wire that goes between the two sides of your brain. And because when that wire is cut, the brain cannot communicate efficiently across the gap. And because of our physiology, one eye is connected to one brain lobe and the other eye is connected to the other brain lobe. So you can actually communicate to one half of your brain if that corpus callosum is cut by simply covering an eyeball. Super fascinating experiment. They found that when you cover one eye and tell a story to one half of the brain, and then have that brain take an action, and then you talk to the other side of the brain and you show any contradictions that show up, when you remove the eyes and you're talking to both sides of the brain at once, it creates a story that even though it's absurd to any outside observer, makes sense internally to a brain, which makes you think that there's multiple consciousnesses in every brain. So there is no me if I have like 7 consciousnesses in my body. If just a bunch of synapses create, and it's that electrical activity that creates the experience of consciousness, then who am I as Scott? If you cut me up into little pieces. And so this is where my idea, and I go really heavily into this, into the wedge, is that because we are interconnected, because I cannot exist without you and you cannot exist without me, and I cannot exist without the sun, then the only way to think of this is as a super consciousness of everything altogether, which brings me back again to the Big Bang.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that definitely makes sense to me. And I also see within that if you were a scientific reductionist or a materialistic reductionist, you could say, well, what are you talking about? The fact that you cut the brain in half and you showed that your consciousness divides proves that the consciousness lives in your brain. Like, because now look, I've divided your brain, I've divided your consciousness. But so there's always an opportunity with any of this stuff, I feel like, to go either way. Like there's always the temptation to reduce or expand at all times.
Sure.
So I'm kind of with you in terms of like, at a certain point it does come down to like a really untrustworthy thing, which is intuition and feeling, like you were talking about before, like with the napping, the fact that you're aggregating all this information and it becomes this feeling, this intuitive sense of what the world is and what things mean. And at the end of the day, like, that's almost what this all boils down to, because even if you're in a cult, like that's what you've done, is you've manipulated whatever that sense is, like people's feeling sense of like, yes, this must be true, I feel that this is true. And what the fuck is that? Like what is that little aggregated collection of experiences and consciousness and disposition in the world? Like I don't know.
Well, and then there's the question of the value judgment on top of that. When you say something is a cult, it's a negative thing, right? It's like, oh, that person's in a cult. That's all fucked up, right? That person was dumb because they got wrapped up into a cult. I actually think that's a really narrow way to look at human experience, because sometimes when people are in cults, they're getting something that's vital to what they need in life, right? They're getting something vital and they are actually improving. There's, that they feel like they're part of a community. They have friendships that last, and that can be fine. Like that can be totally fine to exist. It's really only when, as you said, that manipulation and sort of bad faith gets involved, like where the guru believes that they are infallible and then they fuck all their students and they take all the money of all their, like when these like legitimate bad things happen, which is why in the Enlightenment Trap, I don't call that group a cult, because I very rarely call any group a cult. And I can see that people obviously had benefits. It doesn't mean that 2 people didn't die in the desert meditating to death until they died, right? But it does mean that we can have this. I can see 2 sides at once. I can see on one side these fake gurus, even if they're consciously fake, can actually make people's lives better. And that's like most people don't want to hear this in the world right now. We want to have black and white, and we hate gray areas. We just want to say, that's wrong, this is right. Tell me the answer. Tell me what's right, Scott. Tell me what's wrong, Scott. And I'll get down deep into it. I'll be like, well, part of it was bad for sure, but this part I actually really liked.
Yeah. No, I'm so with you, man. I think people just need to get comfortable with that cognitive dissonance and get comfortable with that gray area. And like, I think to an extent, you can train yourself to like that feeling. And I've sort of done that through exposure therapy over time. Like doing this podcast so much, all the time, I feel myself pulled in 2 different directions. Like going the super wooey spiritual route where everything is just love and light. Just go with it, go with the flow. It's all beautiful. Everything's perfect. And also the more scientifically rigorous, like, no, we need evidence, we need empirical information to back up what we're saying, or it's nothing. Like I feel myself pulled in those 2 directions all the time. And I've come to like the stretch, I've come to like the feeling of like, pull on my feet a little more, pull on my arms a little more. That there it is. There's the sweet spot. And that's what I'm looking for, is like the sweet spot, which by the way is not static.
Yeah. And I think that's beautiful. That's life. That means you're living, and that means you're asking questions. That means you're becoming more you, and also becoming more the universe at the same time. And And the problem is when either someone on the woo side or someone on the science side says, again, they have the answer, right? Consciousness can't exist. It's only in the brain, says the science guy. And the woo person's like, but it's a feeling that's effervescent and everything else. And like it can be both. We can have the dialectic between these two things. And it is hubris to assume that one will ever be the answer. And if they, and
Totally.
ultimately, if it does become the answer, that someone does finally get the reductivist answer, then what's the point of being alive? If we're just like inert matter, or alternately, we're just God's children, what's the point of being alive? Both lead to in profoundly uninteresting states.
Yeah. Yeah. Well put, man. Well put. And now I serve it up to you, Scott, to somehow take it back into napping.
Oh God!
Close
All right.
it out, since I know that that's your
Yeah. So
current.
the reason why we're doing this is because I have this Kickstarter on a book called Time to Nap, which is about why napping is freaking amazing. And the whole reason I'm writing this book is because I want you overworked, groggy human being who lives under electric lights all the time in an eternal summer to realize that it's perfectly okay to take a nap and feel better, access your creativity, access new memories and dreams, and how that changes your life. And I'm trying to raise like literally $5,000, which is very little money on Kickstarter, which covers the cost for hiring an editor and an audio book engineer. And this is the basics, not my time, just like the hard costs. And I'd love you guys to check it out, because the weird discussion we're having here, which only really touched on napping and dream states, I have it in that book. And if you buy the book, you can show the book to somebody who's trying to tell you that you have to work or do something else. And you can say, no, Scott told me I can nap, and he's enlightened.
Yeah, man. Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I will say that is an enlightened point to make for sure. And also it's a noble thing to try to like drip into the zeitgeist. No, man, that we need to rest to be better doers.
It makes you more productive.
The world needs that.
If you can turn down just a little bit from like the constant alertness and give your time to grow, you actually do things better. Like I'm napping as a part of my book. Like before I write, I sit down and I nap. When my wife comes in or someone comes in, I can just tell them I'm working here, which is amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, man. Hopefully Putin gets it, because that guy definitely needs a nap.
Oh, dude.
You can tell that. Yeah.
Everyone up there needs a nap. Everyone needs to like think a little bit more abstractly and just get a little less rigid, because we are so rigid in our thinking, and just resting a little bit will help us do that. A lot of things will help us do that, but resting is easy. And you want to take a nap. You're listening to this right now and you're thinking, dude, I want to take a nap at 3 p.m. today.
That's a great time for a nap too.
Mm-hmm.
That is a great time for a nap. All right, man. Well, it's been a great one. I think this is my favorite mind meld of ours, Scott. So thanks for doing it.
You said that last time.
Well, I lied. This one's better.
Awesome. All right. Well, this has been a blast. As always, this has been a lot of fun.